There you go.
Yeah, so Diana and I will be kind of co-facilitating this. As I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about flood risk and coastal resilience strategies neighborhood-wide, and then we're going to talk about 3 key focus areas where we see an opportunity for really kind of more imaginative design and opportunities for the integration of public benefits into the coastal resilience solution. And those are Constitution Beach, Belle Marsh, and Chelsea Creek. And we'll talk about each of these individually. And as we're walking through these, I think we really want to make sure that you're helping us think through questions about our process and preliminary ideas that you have. You know, what is unclear? What can we communicate better? Additional ideas that you have that you're not seeing here, and then amenities and activities that you'd like to see as part of these solutions that were not presented here today. So first, just to ground this even further in flood risk, the coastal flood risk, I should say, in East Boston. So this is a plan view map of our neighborhood, of our study area in East Boston. And what you see here is today's flood risk, and it shows a range of different types of storms. So what we're looking at is in the darkest blue, and this will carry over into the next slides. You know, the darkest blue shows what a severe winter storm or nor'easter might look like, a storm we might expect to see pretty frequently. And then the lighter blue, the mid-shade blue, is a winter storm that's similar to Winter Storm Riley, you know, a major coastal storm or nor'easter that causes flooding in the neighborhood. And then the lightest shade of blue is a very significant storm, something even larger than Hurricane Sandy that was experienced in New York. So something that wouldn't happen very frequently, but would have a significant impacts. And what you can see is today, the risk of flooding, coastal flooding in East Boston is largely in our study area is largely around Suffolk Downs and Belle Marsh. And we don't see significant flood pathways into the neighborhood except for small areas around Constitution Beach and along Chelsea Creek. But with 9 inches of sea level rise, which is expected, around 2030, we start to see much more significant impacts. So by that time, a severe winter storm event, something that might happen pretty frequently with 9 inches of sea level rise, starts to overtop the shoreline at Constitution Beach and along Chelsea Creek, and even more so around Suffolk Downs. And this is what we call flood pathways. These red arrows indicate areas where water is overtopping the existing shoreline and entering the neighborhood, and it's causing those waters to travel inland to low-lying areas and causing the kinds of impacts and disruption that we talked about during the main presentation. Next slide. And by the time that we see 40 inches of sea level rise on or before roughly 2070s, the risk becomes even more pronounced. And so by that time, even a more routine storm event, a nor'easter that we might see every couple of years, will have really significant impacts across the neighborhood, with new flood pathways opening up and flood pathways connecting across neighborhoods, so that we see that you have to take action across the neighborhood to have a solution that provides benefits elsewhere in the neighborhood. And we'll talk more about kind of the overall solutions in just a second here. So this is a map that shows the extent of the what is 40 inches of sea level rise with a 0.1% annual chance storm. And that's what I was talking about when I said a really large storm that has a low chance of happening. We can think of it as often called the 1,000-year storm, but it has a 0.1% chance of happening in any given year. So very low probability of occurring. But when it does occur, it will have very significant impacts. And we use this storm, this scenario, to as the basis for our design solutions. And so when we think about what elevation needs to be achieved in order to protect and close these flood pathways, this is the storm that we're looking at, this very significant storm that would happen with 40 inches of sea level rise. And what's shown here is kind of the comprehensive view of the locations that flood protection could go in the neighborhood to protect against this type of storm, this type of event. And I'll walk through kind of this in detail. We're going to focus on a couple of key areas, as I mentioned before, Belle Isle Marsh, Chelsea Creek, and Constitution Beach. But if you can go back one slide, Diana, just to walk through, sorry, I jumped the gun there. No worries. So there's a couple different types of flooding. As I mentioned, there are the flood pathways, the kind of red arrows that we talked about, that I talked about a moment ago. And then there are areas of kind of what we would call fringe flooding, flooding that only impacts waterfront sites. And so as we walk along the waterfront along Chelsea Creek on the north side of this map, we see that the majority of the sites in these locations are, before we get to the central part of Chelsea Creek, are largely fringe flooding. So flooding that really only impacts the waterfront sites. And in fact, a lot of these sites are waterfront industrial uses that are dependent upon the waterfront for their viability. And so we don't want to implement flood protection solutions at a scale or in a way that would interrupt or disturb those uses in the near term while they're there. And so in those places, we recommend building level flood protection. So adaptation that happens by private or public property owners to protect buildings and sites and properties without developing kind of more district scale flood protection. But as we move along Chelsea Creek, we see the first kind of major flood pathway that enters along Route 1A, and that spans the entire neighborhood exactly where Diana's cursor is there. And so in that location, we're going to talk about a couple different locations for where flood protection could be located, either at the water's edge or in the public right-of-way along Route 1A. And it's important to note that Route 1A is an evacuation corridor, so it's very important to protect that roadway. Going over to Belle Isle Marsh, there's a number of options here. We obviously see that there's significant flood pathways that exist in this area. And so providing protection along Bennington Street is one of the key strategies that we're recommending. And then looking at a couple different options for residential areas that kind of surround that area, either building scale or a protection that would be located at the water's edge around that neighborhood. Moving down to the Orient Heights Rail Yard, just before jumping to Constitution Beach. This is regional infrastructure, transportation infrastructure that the community and regional residents area-wide depend on to get around, to get to work, to get to places that they enjoy. And the Orient Heights Rail Yard is a critical part of that system, so it's critical to protect. And the solution in this location looks at actually providing a protection around the perimeter of that facility, wrapping to Saratoga Street. And then at Constitution Beach, which we'll talk about in great detail in just a second, we have a real opportunity to not just close a flood pathway that enters over and through Constitution Beach, but also to see this as an opportunity to build community resilience in a really holistic way through the introduction of new public amenities and public experience that has many benefits for the East Boston community. And then finally, the last place to mention is by Logan Airport in Wood Island, where Diana is circling now. This is largely Massport-owned land area that floodwaters connects between the Phase II study area and the Phase I study area, and needs to be closed. Luckily, this flood pathway is very long-term. It doesn't emerge until we see 40 inches of sea level rise. So we have time to plan for this area, but is nevertheless an important area to focus on. So next slide, Diana, is our focus areas. And I think I'm going to turn it over to you now to kind of start to walk through these.
Thank you, Trevor. We're so excited to kind of dial into detail. And one of the first focus areas we're going to zoom into is Constitution Beach. Throughout our sort of community engagement and feedback, it was, this beach and the amenities provided here just for a vital lifeline for the community. And we really wanted to look at, what exists here? What are sort of some of the amenities that draw people to this area? Everything from barbecuing to hanging out on the beach to, bringing your kids here to the playground. we really wanted to holistically understand how this site operates today. And so what we wanted to do is taking, Trevor's analysis and working with the community, sort of cut a slice, almost like a section, like if you're cutting a cake, through Constitution Beach to sort of get an understanding of what the condition is and what potential opportunities lie with coastal solutions here. So as I mentioned, when we look at the Constitution Beach section here, you can see the beach. We're at about elevation +6. And we also have the blue line, which sort of runs on the backside of the site, and is important as we start to think about protecting this critical infrastructure as part of these solutions. So with the first scenario that we sort of looked at as a team, we were really looking at what would it mean to provide new flood protection. So in this case, we're looking at reinforcing the edge and bringing the elevation up to elevation 16, which is about 10 feet, 10-foot difference from what exists there today closest to the beach. And really think about this ribbon that sort of meanders through Constitution Beach to still allow for beach access and barbecuing, but also introduce new amenities that not only are protecting this area, but provide opportunities for fishing or performance venues or areas for the community to come together. So we really see this reinforced dune as providing both ecological opportunities and opportunities for socialization and cultural building within the community. And now what's important about all of this is that we also want to understand, well, what does this mean, right? When Trevor was talking about that once in a generation storm, how does our flood protection, right, that elevation +16 mean, and how do those storms interact with this landscape during these events? And really what it means is that when we do have these larger storm events with 40 inches of sea level rise, we're going to see some erosion of the beach areas that exist today. But with this sort of ribbon, it allows for that beach to migrate inward and for us to still be able to build in the protection that would protect both the critical infrastructure like the blue line and many of the residences and important infrastructure that lies behind the existing alignment we've drawn here. So in this section, you can see how that elevation, that +16, really works in relationship with the types of storms you would typically see. And that lowest elevation, the sort of lighter blue line here, really speaks to what we would see as sort of the mean high water elevation, which is really the sort of tidal fluctuation level that would exist on the site on a regular basis. And now we also took another look at exploring other options. So if this sort of reinforced dune isn't possible, what else could we imagine here? And the second option really looks at this sort of raised pathway with the flood wall that, again, we're sort of trying to be able to protect the neighborhood, but still provide ways in which to access the beach. So with really thinking about, ADA accessible ramps and opportunities for berming and stairs that sort of allow for a gradual rise up to that sort of elevation that creates this elevated pathway that then can bring you back down to the beach access. And as with the first scenario, with this solution, because the flood protection is closer to sort of the existing beach line, you can see how these different storms come in a little bit more inland, right? So if we're having, that once in a generation storm with 40 inches of sea level rise, during that storm event, the beach wouldn't be accessible. But you can see that the 2070 mean high water elevation is low enough to still provide for some of that beach access to remain, but certainly not as sort of expansive as we had shown in the first option. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Trevor here to sort of talk through these two options and what were some of the considerations we took into account as we were designing these.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. And I'll do this quickly because I'm interested in hearing what people think about these two scenarios. But some of the considerations just to think about, one, both of these scenarios reduce risk to the transportation network, including the MBTA Blue Line. They both have the opportunity to reduce risk to the buildings in the neighborhood adjacent to the beach. And as I mentioned before, this is an area where protection would be needed in multiple areas of East Boston. So this is just one area where action would be needed to have a fully resilient solution. However, there are some key differences. Scenario one has the opportunity for more natural benefits. So dunes can provide benefits for plants and animals, more new amenities. So really it imagines a kind of reconfiguration of the park, working in close partnership with Department of Conservation and Recreation at the state level, who owns this facility. Both options, but in particular the reinforced dune scenario, have the potential to affect views of the water, meaning that it could be harder to see the water from the inland areas. And this one could take longer to build. It's more complicated, it's bigger, and so it could take longer to implement than scenario two. Scenario two, some of the key items there would maybe quicker to build, so it could be implemented more quickly. It does maintain more of the sandy beach, takes up less space, less of a invasive or less of a significant reimagining of the park. But may come with fewer new amenities. So many of the amenities that exist in Constitution Beach today could be maintained, but less opportunity to kind of think about additions through the flood protection solution. So at this point, I think we are happy to answer questions, and some of the key questions I think are, what are your general feelings about this? But are there things that concern you, or things that you'd love to see added to this type of proposal? Yeah, and feel free to either go off mute, or, as I think Kat said, put your comments in the chat as well.
Hi, this is Francisco. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Francisco.
Yeah.
Hi. So looking at these two scenarios, I go to Constitutional Beach a lot, so I just picturing myself in these two scenarios. And I know, like you said, scenario one, it's easier to build and everything, but scenario one, I think, is more like community oriented. Like got the space for public events, and it has the little ramp there to fish. And here in East Boston, I seen like a lot of people trying to fish, even at the bridge going to Chelsea, both bridges, I see people trying to fish there, even though there's not a lot of space. So I don't think we have like a lot of space to do fishing here in East Boston. I've been to a few places in Winthrop. I seen that they have done a few ramps like this to fish, and I see like a lot of people doing fishing. So I think that will be very beneficial to the community. I think we have a large of community that likes to do fishing, and we don't have the space to do so. So it's very interesting. I love scenario one.
Thank you, Francisco. Is there anything you feel like is missing in terms of amenities? Is there anything else you wish we could either remove or add that's not represented here?
To be honest, it looks like very complete, so it's very hard to. And if you add I think the scenario one, it has some things from scenario two, so it's still protect. I know, like the presenter was saying, it will take longer to build, and it has to work with different departments, like the Department of Recreation or the state, to work it out, because there's when I see the picture, there's some stuff that have been removed, so it probably will take longer. But I think in my opinion, it's worth it to wait.
Thank you, Francisco. Are there any others that'd like to add their thoughts to the conversation?
And Phil in the chat asked if we can show both renderings again.
Certainly. Let's see. So here's scenario 2. Again, still trying to keep some of these amenities in place. And then here is an image of scenario 1.
Can you show them next to each other? Is there a possibility?
So I think the only one we have, unfortunately, is the 2 smaller ones here.
Yeah. Okay. Guess I need to see the bigger one. Sorry.
If I can also support the scenario 1, I really like the fact that the beach will remain, for use in the future. I think that's super important for the community.
Thank you, Judith. Are there any programs you feel like we should also take into consideration as we're thinking about that scenario?
Well, I think maybe like you could also add I don't know if it's there actually. Maybe it's already there, like some vending opportunities, like food vending, I don't know, like food trucks, something like that.
That's a great idea. Actually, we did not show that. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
I like the addition of the additional green space in scenario 1. I know there's a lot of interest on the greenway further down in Eastie, and some additional outdoor park-like area would be really good. And, I don't go up to Constitution Beach all that often, but just some additional green space in the area would be really nice.
I guess I think I go to the beach when it's hot, and so you need to get away. It's a little cooler up there, so as much space as you can add, there'll be more people. There'll be all of a sudden these Suffolk Downs residents as well going to Belle Isle and whatnot. So I think I can't tell from here, sorry, that which one has more space to take your family. I mean, I've been watching the place for many years, so people need a place to spread out. You don't want to be like sardines up there. Kids throw the ball on occasion. I think the park is still there. So I think people need a place to spread out and just go to the beach. That's what it's about. A place for kids and younger kids to get a spray pool or something where you're watching the kids as well. Not every little kid likes to go in the water, or the mom or dad wants them to go down there. Kind of thing. So, people take their bikes. So you've got to take a bike here and there. I think you haven't taken any parking. I can't really tell what's happening with parking on this, but people will still drive.
Thank you, Phil. And to answer the parking question, in both scenarios, we have retained the existing parking. Great. Well, this is really wonderful. I really appreciate everyone speaking up. And I think, continue to, if you have more ideas or wanted to say something but didn't get the chance, put it in the chat. And as Trevor mentioned earlier, we're going to advance to sort of the next sort of opportunity area we've been looking at. But we're always here to take the feedback and comments, and would love to sort of continue the conversation. Great. So with that, we're going to go ahead and transition over to Belle Isle Marsh. So Bill, you had a great transition in thinking about how developments such as Suffolkstown and that existing neighborhood and the relationship of Bennington Street work with the future of Belle Isle Marsh and this very unique and important ecological feature. So when we zoom into the site, you can see Belle Isle Marsh here, Bennington Street, which sort of runs along the edge, and the Suffolkstown train station just off to the left, and then the Suffolkstown development all the way to the left of this image here. And we do want to say that, we're certainly not representing here the Suffolk-Down development, but certainly would direct you all to the latest materials that exist for that development. And we've certainly been taking it into consideration as we look at these solutions. So what we're going to do is just take a quick cut through this area, cutting through the train station, and really looking at the existing conditions here for BELLE Marsh, really understanding the recreation and ecological habitat that exists on the site today, and how the existing elevation, right, of the paths that connect you to this area exist. So, and one of the things too that became very real for us when we were visiting the site with the cab was how difficult it was to cross the street. So, there's 4 lanes of traffic here that exists as an existing condition between the existing train station and the connection to the marsh. So with the first scenario that our team looked at, we were really looking at the sort of raised berm. And the idea is that you sort of have this reinforced flood protection in the form of a clay core that would help to protect this area. And what we would create is a sort of gradual slope that would allow for the sort of vertical migration of the habitat that exists right now in BELLE Marsh. So as sea level rise, as the water sort of increases in these areas, we would allow for that habitat and those species to be able to migrate up to higher elevations that meet closer to this 16 elevation. So we're looking at about a 4-foot difference between what exists there today, which is about 12 feet above sea level, and 16, which is what we are designing to. And in this scenario, we also wanted to look at opportunities for better connectivity across Bennington Street, particularly getting to the train station and other areas in a more accessible way. And it's also important for us to understand, right, how we can think about protecting this unique ecological feature and still protecting the neighborhood and Bennington Street. So in this case, you can see how that once in a generation storm, which is what we're designing to, meets up with our sort of designed pathway and berm here. And it really does create, again, opportunities for us to still have a planted zone that allows for that vertical migration of the habitat that exists here within the marsh. And with scenario number 2, we were looking at an alternative option, which is looking at raising the roadway to that elevation 16. So in this case, it would be more of a flood wall condition where there would be unique access points for recreation that to the BELLE Marsh, but it will remain at sort of a lower elevation. So you can see sort of here in this section how that drop would exist. So you would see that 4-foot difference between the marsh as it exists today and the roadway and pathway, which would all now be raised to elevation 16. And in this scenario, again, this doesn't, without having that sort of vertical planted zone, it does remove our ability to be able to allow for that vertical migration of habitat. But it still provides protection to the neighborhood and allows for that once in a generation storm to still be below the elevations we're designing to. Great, I'll hand it over to Trevor.
Yeah, and I think, here we see more substantial differences between the 2 scenarios in Constitution Beach. Both of these kind of provide the same benefits, right? They are protecting the evacuation corridor on Bennington Street. They're protecting the East Boston, the MBTA Blue Line. They're providing opportunities for improved public access and recreation along the marsh. And both, of course, it's important to mention, will require deep ongoing coordination with the city of Revere, as they will need to tie into a solution on the other side of the fence in Revere from Boston. So that is an important consideration that's part of either of these solutions. But in terms of the differences, the major kind of key distinction is that scenario one, while it does have the opportunity to provide natural benefits in the form of kind of ecological restoration and the ability to enable marsh migration, the design would impact the marsh directly. So it would, because you have a kind of berm condition, you would need to actually develop and have part of the investment, part of the design located within the marsh. And so that could take longer to build. It wouldn't necessarily be possible today under today's regulations, but maybe in the future if those regulations change. So that's why we're thinking about this as a potential future scenario. Then scenario two kind of takes an alternative approach that looks to minimize impacts to the wetlands. So it may not provide the long-term ecological benefits, but in the near term, it could be built much more quickly because it's within kind of the existing footprint of Bennington Street today, and wouldn't require any kind of design intervention within the marsh. The other important thing to mention, just that scenario two does contemplate or look at raising Bennington Street. And so that could have impacts on the properties that need to access Bennington Street. So you may need to reconfigure driveways and access to the Suffolk Downs T station in order to provide access to the elevated Bennington Street. So those are kind of the key distinctions. Interested in hearing folks' thoughts on these scenarios.
I'll try something to get it going. I think there may be too much pavement on Bennington Street anyway. It's an ugly street the way it currently is. There's no landscaping. It's dangerous to try to cross. I mean, in a number of years, I think that will change, but I don't see any reason to raise it. Why don't we take some of Bennington Street and move west or to your left, so you don't have to take more of the marsh, let the marsh move towards the street and take some of that. Again, there's too much blacktop, there's too much pavement, maybe that's an option. I don't see any logic really in raising a street for any particular reason. So I do like the ability for the marsh to migrate a little bit. And if there's anybody here from Belle Isle Marsh, I almost always defer to their expertise and commitment to that. But just as watching this, I like the elevation, I like watching the marsh, I like the ability to migrate a little bit and to protect it by raising it, but I don't see any advantage in keeping the street the way it is and move that to the left and take care of the marsh.
Yeah, and Phil, that's a good, just to highlight work that the BPDA is doing on Plan East Boston.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a representative from that team in here. I know Joe is here, but they are looking at a reconfiguration of Bennington Street through that process that does reduce the kind of overall amount of space dedicated to pavement. So we're kind of taking into account the additional space that may exist in the Bennington Street layout, that's not going to be allocated to vehicular lanes and maybe reallocated to bicycle and pedestrian access and flood protection.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a straight street either. In any case, I'm actually this may be the easier part of Belle Isle Marsh. I'm a little bit more worried about how we protect right around the, unless you're going to show that, how we protect the houses or buy them out, let the marsh migrate that way. I don't know if there's any thinking on that. This is relatively easy. It seems to be. The other part is more complicated, I think.
Certainly, Phil. And I think for these zoom in areas, we were only zooming in to what you're calling the easy part. But we've certainly, as Trevor sort of outlined earlier in the presentation, have been looking at scenarios for both building level protection and also water's edge protection for the edge of the housing in that area as well, where the housing
I mean,
exists.
you might even, as a scenario, is to sort of buy out the properties. I mean, those are areas where the marsh could migrate. And how much do we have to spend on X number of units on one of those challenging economic, what's the cost benefit ratio of preserving X number of units of housing right there. In any case, I would ask the question. It's going to happen in other places. Might as well ask them here too, see what they get.
Bill, I just wanted to go back to your first point and say that agreed. And Trevor, I think you covered the Plan East Boston context effectively, but good points there. And yeah, the bio thing is certainly something for discussion as well.
Marcos, I saw that you put a comment in the chat. I'm curious if maybe you could elaborate on that. The question that is, it seems like in scenario one, the area of marsh would be effectively expanded in area. If I understand correctly, that, the question, that would not be necessarily the case. We wouldn't have expanded area for marsh necessarily, but we'd have higher elevation. We'd be raising the elevation of the existing area. So kind of providing that higher elevation that certain types of habitat wants to be at within the marsh.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too that I agree with Phil's point about, shifting the road rather than shifting the marsh. I think that road is too wide and it would be a traffic calming effect too. The only concern obviously would be to what extent it would affect a potential evacuation route. That would be the only other concern.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. So I like from a scenario one that the path is wider and it seems like you could interact with the marsh as compared to scenario two where it's just like, right, like a rail, right? You cannot go into the marsh. So I was wondering if there are any more like ideas for like recreational ideas to incorporate into the marsh for the community.
Those are great ideas, Judith. And I think there's certainly some opportunity, I think, with everything we've been discussing today, right, to think about with more space, right? Are there new amenities we can introduce to BELLE Marsh, right, to attract the community to this area? Just curious, is there anything that would bring you out to BELLE Marsh? Are there any activities that would make it desirable for you to come here?
Yeah, like a hiking path would be nice. Maybe like some spots to picnic.
Awesome.
You're here, Marcos. I agree.
We Judith, we had a very serious mosquito. We went to the site in the afternoon and let's just say they had a feast with us.
But on a serious note, I was just curious. I mean, how is there an imbalance that makes the mosquitoes that bad? Is it that time of the year? I mean, because it didn't seem like it was a practical space to bring a bunch of people without suffering.
The marsh, hey Latifah, this is Sanjay. The marsh has a lot of ditches in it, in part because people thought that would get rid of mosquitoes. As we saw on our trip, that's not the case. It is kind of a natural condition of a marsh to have a lot of insect life, and that's why it attracts birds, and that's why it's one of the best places to see birds in Boston. So it's not an unnatural condition. There are relationships between climate change and pests and mosquitoes, but I wouldn't say that what we experienced was out of the norm, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the walkway, if it were to happen, doesn't need to be a straight path either. That can have some twists and turns. I'm sure when the artists get a hold of it, they'll have some overlooks and places for people to stop and have a little bit of a refreshment or something like that as well. And that way you're enjoying the marsh without having to be in it, but you can see it and experience it and still feed the mosquitoes if they want to.
You could have some educational like stops, so you learn the mosquitoes that live there and all other like insects.
Great.
Well, they're not there all the time. I think with the breeze and in the daytime, they're probably not around as much. But take your chances when you go to dust and humidity.
Great. Are there any other comments? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. This was super exciting. And as I said before, we'd love to continue to get your feedback, and feel free to add your comments into the chat. So with that, we're going to move on to the last focus area we've been looking at in East Boston, which is Chelsea Creek. And as Trevor mentioned, this is a very unique site. We have, 1A, which is a really important corridor for evacuation and certainly in need of protection, and also really understanding how this flood pathway, right, really impacts the greater neighborhood and actually connects with some of the flood pathways over on Constitution Beach. So in this scenario, we've been looking at the existing condition, really trying to understand, right, how these industrial uses interact with the creek as it exists today, and the relationship, right, of Highway 1A in relationship to the community to the left. So in this condition, we have the existing elevation at about elevation 10, about 10 feet above sea level, and the 2 lanes on either side of roadway, and then sort of the neighborhood off to the side, and some of the industrial uses right along, situated right on the water's edge. And so with this scenario, which is the raised roadway with the flood wall, we were really looking at how can we protect, right, this important evacuation route by raising the roadway in this condition, being able to provide a multi-use trail along the edge that can provide access for bikers and pedestrians alike, and also make room for some of those spaces along the water where we can create pockets of open space and recreation for individuals that are coming from the community onto the site. And now with this scenario here, when we look at how this 40 inches of sea level rise and that once in a generation storm impact this area, you can see how by raising the roadway and providing this new pathway, we're protecting the neighborhood off to the left here, but these private industrial uses that exist on the water's edge today would require building level protection. And what we mean by that is that these private properties themselves would take on measures with guidance from the city on how to protect that building infrastructure as it exists. But the public protection would exist on the left side of that, where that multi-use pathway, as I mentioned earlier, would exist. And now with scenario number 2, unlike the scenario I showed in the beginning, we're not raising the roadway, and we're actually looking at elevating grade closer to the water's edge and being able to look at a future vision of being able to build out into Chelsea Creek and create a raised berm condition with the opportunity for restoring the ecology of that edge with more of a sort of living shoreline condition. And again, in this scenario, being able to provide opportunities for recreation, for walking and trails, and really looking at how some of these uses, industrial uses, perhaps can be retrofitted in the future to provide access for communities and community amenities. And with this scenario, as you can see, this berm condition would reduce some of your views out into the water, but would certainly protect the neighborhood and some of the buildings that would exist to the left of it. And as you can see in the sort of zoom in here, that once in a generation storm with the 40 inches of sea level rise, you know, hits several feet below the existing, the proposed pathway that would define this approach for scenario 2. I'll hand it over to Trevor again.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. And yeah, so similar story here. I mean, this is an area that has been studied in depth by the community, and I think is an area where a lot of people see a lot of opportunity. So I just want to acknowledge that both scenarios here do protect Route 1A, which is the evacuation corridor. They both protect the majority of the neighborhood by closing off the flood pathway that we looked at in the beginning of this session. And it's important to note that you know, both of these will require a lot of coordination between the city, the MBTA, Mass DOT, and the waterfront property owners. So regardless of what solution we kind of think about here tonight and through this plan, there's going to be a lot more conversation and communication and coordination that will need to happen. Kind of the main differences between scenario 1 and 2, I think Diana covered it really well. Is that one of them is located at the water's edge, scenario 2, and provides a lot of opportunities for ecological restoration, habitat for plants and birds and fish, and new public access along the waterfront, but will take much longer to implement, because this is a solution that, you know, really couldn't be built today because of a lot of regulations that exist that are there for good reason, to protect the wetlands, to protect water dependent industrial uses. And so those regulations would need to change to enable this type of solution. Scenario 1, on the other hand, could be built more quickly, implemented, you know, in the near future under today's kind of existing regulations. But, you know, while it does provide additional public amenities along Route 1, it doesn't have the same sort of significant reimagining of the space, and also buildings along the waterfront would need to protect themselves or implement solutions at the building scale. So I think the major difference is just the amount of time needed to implement these solutions and the type of impacts that they might have on the community. So I'll stop there and we can discuss. And if anybody, I know we're at the sort of 90-minute threshold, so if folks wanna leave, that's fine, but hang around and continue the conversation. I'm happy to.
And I think we'll add one more thing to Trevor to this, is that we know the community, East Boston has done several studies already for this area. So certainly the scenarios we showed to you here today are also taking into consideration some of that existing planning and aspiration that has been done for Chelsea Creek.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly as we're ending, and I wrote in the chat. I think this is, I think, 2 examples. One for me, what a visual can do to say, gee, I really like that in scenario 2. Let's get that one done. On the other hand, it's also an example of, we're probably not going to do that because hardscaping Route 1 is probably a lot easier, and spending the money elsewhere is probably going to give you more bang for the buck. So I think I'm just saying visuals are often make a difference for me in seeing what can be done, as one-dimensional as this is. But, you know, hardscaping Route 1 to keep the water on one side and traffic and elevation and protection on the other side is probably the more realistic solution in this regard, because you're not adding a significant amount by having to change the world to get, you know, add a few more yards or ecology into Chelsea Creek, and maybe affect shipping as well. Anyway, enough of that. Thank you.
Is there actually a traffic study that's done with lessening the width of the roads so that it's still effective with the amount of cars that come down? Or is this, I mean, has that already been looked into?
Yeah, Latifah, that's a great point. I mean, Massachusetts Department of Transportation is in the early stages of looking at this area and looking at transportation capacity as well as the kind of overall needs. So that's going to be a study that's launching fairly soon, I believe. I don't know the exact timing, but I think to the broader point, yes, there would need to be kind of a study of, what is the appropriate, capacity for Route 1A given the traffic demands. We're not planning totally in a vacuum. This is a regional roadway, right? A state roadway that provides access to the city of Boston. So there are factors like that need to be accounted for. We're sort of looking at, what are the opportunities within the existing footprint of the road, but through a future design process, there are opportunities to think about, reconfigurations and reimagining of the roadway.
I also just wanted to ask, in terms of programming, is there any type of organized program that happens explicitly about the birds that are there that people can plug into?
Yeah, I think, the best part about East Boston is the amount of community organizations that kind of adopt and create programs with the amenities that exist. So it's not that in Coast Resilient Solutions will be speaking to individual kind of recommendations for program in that sense, but we've heard tonight signage, overlooks, engagement with nature, both in Belle Isle and here. And so that can be things we show in our visuals a little bit, how folks can have new access to do the things that they might want to do. Does that answer your question, Latifa?
Yeah, I was just curious if there's somewhere where I scan a barcode and I find out the latest and greatest birds that have come there, have been there, migrated away. When the heat gets high, they're likely not to return, and it's changed. I mean, just like an understanding of the landscape of bird life.
I agree. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And, I think we want to, emphasize that these are conceptual still. And so when we get into a further design process for each of these areas and each of these projects or not projects, but solutions that we're recommending or will recommend, that's the kind of stuff that we would want to zoom into when we're getting to actual design and be like, this is an element that we would want to include in the project. So that's a really fantastic suggestion.
I have a question regarding the water quality from the Chelsea Creek, because I believe it's super contaminated currently, but maybe, I don't know, like in 10 years, it is not anymore or something. I don't know if that's also aligned to the plans. If not, then I guess I would go for scenario 1, so less people can access the water. And if it's going to be remediated, then I would go to scenario 2, or one that people could have access to the waterfront. It seems that number 2, it's more geared into that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in both cases, folks will be able to access the water, but to your point, the value of accessing water is different if you're not sure it's safe. This is still an industrial area, or it has industrial uses and community uses, and so that mix is always tough to balance. And that's why, considering ecological restoration as a part of any solution is helpful. There's a limit to what adding some plants to the edge can do in terms of cleaning Chelsea Creek. The reason Chelsea Creek is polluted is because of how it's used and the history of it and the extent of the pollution. So that's, we can definitely speak to it in our work, but the broader solution to Chelsea Creek is a much more focused effort that would need to be done to make sure that it's always safe to swim in.
Yeah, and I think, the water quality in Chelsea Creek has been improving slowly, but it has improved over what it historically was in the heyday of its industrial usage. So we're headed in the right direction. And one of the questions about when we talked about the evaluation criteria and co-benefits is, the driver is providing the flood protection, but can a solution help accelerate or improve that process of improving water quality in Chelsea Creek? And scenario 2 definitely has the potential to do it. As Sanjay said, there's limits to how much impact one project or one area can have, but scenario 2 has that potential in the long term to help improve water quality.
Yeah, and if I could also add, I want another point. Like I think, like environmental justice could also be done here, for the people that are living around there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Judith. That's such a great point. And I think certainly with both of these scenarios, we want to look at being able to protect the community and these important corridors. But certainly with scenario 2, that's looking further into the future. It's about reimagining, right? How Chelsea Creek could be used, right? In a way that is more just for the community. Wonderful. Are there any others that have any additional comments on Chelsea Creek? Awesome. Well, like we said, we're around. We're always really open to taking all your feedback and incorporating it into the design. And as Kat and Trevor mentioned, you know, these are preliminary. We're really just starting to kind of get our heads and arms around these sites and really holding in your feedback has been really wonderful up to this date, and hearing all the wonderful ideas we heard today is going to be even better as we start to dial into further detail with next steps of this project. So with that, I just want to say thank you. I'll hand it over to Trevor and Kat to kind of wrap things up, but thank you all for being here today. It's such a privilege to be doing this with all of you. And as we mentioned, we're happy to share these materials so you can share it with your community and get the word out.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. And I would just plug, I know we covered a lot of material and there was a lot of information that was presented tonight. So we have here a link in the lower left, as well as a QR code that you can hold your phone up to for an intake form. Or really a form you can fill out to request a member of the project team to present to a community group that you're part of, or even if you want to have a one-on-one conversation about this, we're happy to schedule that with you and make sure that we answer your questions and take your feedback as much as possible. And of course, the project websites are always the sort of place to find the latest information on the project. So I'll echo Diana and say thank you very much. It really is a privilege to be here with you all, and we really appreciate and value your time here tonight. I know it's not the best to sit in front of a computer on a nice summer evening, so very much appreciate that. And I'll just, Kat, Sanjay, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up here?
Just echoing, I'm really grateful for everyone who came out tonight, and for those of you who had such great feedback for us. We really appreciate it, and this isn't the end of the conversation, so we hope that you'll keep telling us what you would like to see.
Great, thanks everybody.